So if this is your first time to the new studio space, welcome. I'm slowly getting back on my feet. I've only been here a week. This is my second video I'm churning out, so hopefully the audio is going to be okay and the lighting is decent. I wanted to spend some time talking about the Explorer 2. On the one hand, it's one of the most unexpected success stories from the brand, sure. But then also as a watch community, we spend an inordinate amount of time researching, categorizing, studying, and talking about how a model like the 16570 is one of the best watches ever made. And considering that this model line originated in the 1970s, at a period in time that was very peculiar, quartz was on its way, many other things. And when we think about the story of how this watch arrived niche-less, carved out its own niche, it's worth exploring. The 1970s, 20 years before my time, but let's start by saying this, that the 70s was a period that fostered designs very much of that time. We could say, arguably, that many of these trends and styles have dated the worst if we look back in time. Think of fashion of that time. Think of appliances and products. The 70s sure didn't know what the future would look like, but so much of it was still analog. And as we know, through the 70s, everything seems to change overnight. And this mishmash of old school, retro futurism going on, some interesting ideas definitely percolated around this time. But I'll ask you this question. If it were not for the massive revival of integrated bracelet sports watches and a couple of other good designs here and there, would we still look back fondly at 1970s watch design today? I say this because Rolex of the 70s, very vanilla to say the least. Besides the icons that really made names for themselves before the time and kept on building, and arguably the two-tone Datejust, which I think had a massive part to play through the 1970s and onwards, as well as a watch like the full gold day-date. Most sports-oriented designs introduced by Rolex through the 1970s, they did not grab people. We have to remember, after all, that this was the time of quartz being introduced, and it was dubbed Timekeeper of the future, so naturally the novelty of mechanical and automatic watches was failing. So the idea of introducing new watches in this field, it didn't really go that well. It's a funny thing to think that we hold on to this nostalgia so fondly today, but watches, mechanical instruments of this kind, they were instruments. They were used for a very specific task. It was not about jewelry, it was not about fashion, it was about purpose. If you didn't have a watch to tell the time accurately, you were a step behind. The Swiss watch industry was very much on its knees in the 1970s, and so many brands had to pack up and ship off. But Rolex at this time, not being the powerhouse that they're known as today, they were continually trying to get in on the action. Always. Through advertising, marketing, collaborations, partnerships. This was their thing. And we need look no further than the infamous Daytona. Introduced around 1963, but all the way through the 70s, it was a watch with a very flat reputation. Manual winding, it was expensive, kind of generic looking as a design. Many of these watches weren't even waterproof. The screw-down pusher was only starting to make an appearance. And since this was a new era for the Rolex brand and the Daytona, they hadn't established themselves as chronograph ateliers compared to what they were doing through the 40s and the 50s with those incredible pieces. The Daytona was going up against pre-established names like the Hoya Monaco, Hoya Carrera, Zenith Al Primero, Universal Genève Compacts, Omega Speedmaster, all of which were more successful. And what set them apart is that all of these other manufacturers, they had in-house chronograph calibers, high beat movements, automatic winding. Putting it bluntly, these pieces were far more sophisticated compared to the fairly rudimentary Daytona. So it's no wonder why it wasn't a success. And I'm doing all of this foreshadowing because in 1971 they introduced a prototype-looking watch that they labeled the Explorer 2. Once again trying to get in on the action, trying to engage hobbyists and enthusiasts around a new field. Cave exploring, spelunking, rock climbing, Arctic exploration. This was a huge time of discovery, and of course National Geographic magazines, these watches were featured in there heavily. But compared to the almost untouchable Submariner and GMT Master, both of these pieces were so successful and well respected in their fields, the Explorer 2 was chartering unknown territory. Banking on the success of the original Explorer, the gorgeous 1016 6610 with those incredible aesthetics and a cool backstory. It was trying to find itself in a very specific niche which was slowly catching on at the time. But let's be honest and say that the 1655 was very much a Frankenstein watch. It was an experiment. It was the idea of taking the 1675 GMT, installing a steel bezel with a custom dial, giving it that distinct orange hand. We look back at this watch because it is so 70s cool today. Many of us, me included, would trade a kidney to own one probably. It's unique because where it originated and where it is now, it has always gone against Rolex's design practices, and maybe this is why we like it so much. But it is also kind of useless, and the novelty about it was that you could use it to track AM or PM. If you were lost in a cave for a couple of days, if you were traveling across the Arctic Circle where the sun neither rises nor sets depending on the time of year, the actual day-to-day practicality with this watch is very limited, especially when you compare it against the turning bezel of a GMT or a Submariner. Nevertheless, Rolex tried to sell this watch very hard and failed at it. Now, how this watch transformed into the models that we know today, it's a story that's not often spoken about, and it revolves around Oliver Shepard, a polar explorer who took part in the Trans-Globe expedition, which, if I remember right, happened in the late 1970s. The story goes that Rolex supplied him and his team with a 1655 Explorer 2, but Oliver couldn't read the dial, so he opted for a GMT master dial to be fitted inside it. Apparently 3 of these prototypes were made and only one is known to exist today, that being Oliver Shepard's watch. You can see very clearly that this watch is a 1655 when you look at the case, the bezel, the bracelet, but the dial looks something more like a 16570. Now Rolex themselves won't verify this story. The 1655 lasted between 1971 and 1984, and a year later, 1985, the 16550 arrived with, you guessed it, a design that looks almost identical to what we know today. The belief is that Oliver Shepard's 1655 is the reason for this evolution. But as we hit 1989 until 2010, the 16570 arrives, and most of us here will agree, one of the best watches ever made. And this watch had changed radically compared to its progenitor. It was a lot more generic as a design. It fell into Rolex's design category so well for a professional watch, and I think this is why the brand adopted it so eagerly. I still find it a shame that the 1655 language has been lost. That dial, though odd, though very difficult to read, did create something quite special. But this was also around a time where quick-set date windows were coming in. Quick-set hands were also being involved. So this watch became so much more practical as a daily wearer. The 16570 brought things back down to basics. It streamlined the approach. And as the years have gone on, the 216570, 226570, these watches have been beefed up. They're bulkier in size, I guess, better communicating the professional intent. And it's just great to know that 50 plus years later, the Explorer 2 not being used for spelunking and cave exploring so much anymore, but is still being used in the correct sort of environments. Many travel the world with these watches and they swear by them. So the question is, why is it that the Explorer 2 remains such an infinite source of fascination for us enthusiasts? And the answer is quite deep. Compared to the many other properties and watch designs out there, it remains relatively unique. Considering that a fixed steel bezel and a GMT complication hadn't really been experimented with before this piece. Maybe Rolex themselves didn't see the vision either. Remember, this being the 1970s, the brand was desperate for sales, and they created a Frankenstein watch that has never lined up next to the Submariner or the GMT Master in comparison. It's always been the underdog. Nowadays though, the Explorer 2 with its polar white dial, orange hand accent is a headliner. It has in fact managed to cement itself in its own genre. But other notable details about these watches that make them so good, why us as enthusiasts love them so much, they are quite stealthy. Very easy to interchange with straps. Leather, NATO straps, adding to the watch's overall versatility, whether you're going out dressed up, dressing down casually for the summer. And here is something else we can highlight. Whether we enjoy Rolex watches or not, the Explorer family have always come across as some of the most un-Rolex looking Rolexes ever, if that makes sense. From across the room, they're not the most easiest watches to recognize. They don't necessarily have the same hallmarks and traits that we commonly associate with the brand. And that plays into how the original 1655 went up against the status quo in a way. And the funniest thing of all is that the Explorer 2 is still kinda underrated. It's always going to be in the shadow of the Sub, the GMT, the Daytona, the Skydweller, many other far more successful watches. The Explorer 2 still remains tier 3, not even tier 2 in the sports category, and that's a good thing. It allows for us enthusiasts to actually get our hands on them, to wear them, own them, enjoy them, and not feel so guilty about using them. Unlike many other modern sports Rolexes, these ones still manage to fulfill their intended purpose in one way or another. And I guess this all goes full circle because the Explorer 2 is a watch that strayed off the beaten path, decided to find its own way, and as luck would have it, it became a highly successful property that I don't even think Rolex had imagined. It worked its way into the enthusiast community because of its relative affordability, underratedness, but considering what it offers, considering that it's a GMT but it's not as ostentatious as a GMT, it still is one of the truest reflections of Rolex's original sports ethos. That, I think, in a bite-sized form is the reason why we love this watch, why we continue to come back to it, and why it can be seen as one of the most unexpected success stories that the brand has ever conjured up. Sure, these pieces will never reach the same heights of popularity that the masses will yearn for and go after, but for us, the enthusiasts, who know a little bit about these things. So if you can share your experience with us about the time you have had with an Explorer 2, whether or not you're going after one, whether or not you've had one, or still do own one, what is it about this watch that keeps drawing you back? And from all the references I've mentioned, which one would you want to own? I say this with the hope and dream that it might manifest one day, but owning a 1655, it's one of the few watches, one of the few Rolex watches that I really want to own. Not that this watch gets everything right, that it's almost entirely wrong in so many ways, but that it was such a bold and daring design of that time, and the orange hand sealing that 70s reputation. Thank you for taking the time to watch this video. See you in the next one.